Hi, I'm Charles Galda. Welcome to the Church in Action podcast. We know that when the people of God do the work of God, loving our neighbors, living in unity, people want to know Jesus. And that transforms lives, New England, and the world. So we talk about the ingredients that makes that happen, making disciples who do justice and share Jesus to accelerate evangelism. Today, we're talking about things I think may span all of that because we're taking a slightly different approach. We've got our good friend and brother Enoch Liao back with us. Enoch is the pastor of Boston Chinese Evangelical Church in Boston. And we're going to be talking about what's really been happening over the last 18 months and what God's been doing on it. Enoch, thanks for coming back again.
My pleasure. Good to be here.
So just to tee it up, over the last 18 months, we've experienced disruption of everything in society and in the church and in ministry, from COVID, increases in hate crimes, from unjust killings of people like George Floyd, attacks on the police, divisive election, protests, vandalism, violence, natural disasters, most recently the abandonment of Americans and Afghans to the Taliban. And in all of these conversations, whenever I'm talking to leaders around New England, lay people around New England, I hear the same thing: God's doing something. This is God. Now, God's always doing something, but it seems like God's doing something with His church in all of this. And we say there's no going back. And even with that, though, we have a tendency to want to, right? So we have that muscle memory of how we did things before because we don't know what we're supposed to be doing differently. We don't want to move past it too quickly. And so we're trying to take some time in venues like this and talk about, well, what is God doing? What is it He's wanting us to learn? What is it He's wanting to teach us? I think about like Israel had to go into the exile to learn to stop worshiping foreign idols before they came back. Maybe there's some stuff we need to learn before this will end. And as I was saying to Enoch before we started, if I'm right about it, that doesn't mean if we learn these things, God will end COVID and all of these things. But it does mean that they won't end until we learn those things. And so that's what we're trying to figure out, if we can use the collective wisdom of leaders like Pastor Enoch and others to figure out, well, what is God saying? And let God speak through that process and those conversations. So Enoch has volunteered to put himself on the spot today and pronounce the wisdom we need to hear.
And people are going to know that there's not much here. So
not true. And so Enoch, before we kind of jump into all of that, why don't you just share what your church and you have been experiencing in COVID?
I mean, that's a great question for me because that's probably all I can answer today. But also, interestingly, when I think about what God is doing in my church, the process I think I go through, aside from prayer and scripture, is really listening to what God is doing in individual people's or departments or groups in my church. So in that sense, groups like Vision New England, or anyone who is an avid observer or has a chance to be connected through different groups, is probably really, maybe it scales that way. What is God doing in New England? Well, you yourself, Charles, and others can talk to different leaders and ministers, men and women across the region, and maybe you can help us discern what that is. So I'm happy if our little piece, my little voice, can help be a part of that chorus to help understand the mosaic. So in my church, there's very similar themes, probably that a lot of people have gone through. One question is really, how is the spiritual vitality of the people in our church? Why were they attending in the first place? And why are they still going or not coming back? So our church, you and I are part of the larger church network in Vision New England, but our church is probably a little different in that, unlike a lot of these other churches in New England, where there's one main preacher, right, for maybe one or two services. So if you have over 1,000 people, it's probably the same person preaching to almost all of them most weeks, if not every week. In our church, we have pre-pandemic, 7 congregations. So, there's that old book, The Phantom Toll Booth, the tallest short guy and the shortest tall guy. They're basically the same guy. And are we a church of 7? Are we a really, really, really close-knit association of 7 churches with 1 senior pastor, 1 board of elders, and 1 budget, and 1 board of deacons? Or are we, 7 services, in 1 church? And so when we look at it this way, I think there's a couple differences. Number one, before the pandemic, we struggle with reduplicating so many ministries and programs, right? There are 7 sermons on a Sunday because there are 7 services. Some of us will preach in 2 or 3 of them. I suppose if you're trilingual and could time warp, you could preach in all 7 of them. But even if a leader wanted to preach in all of the services, you can't do it in one day. You got to do it in 2 weeks. When we went into the pandemic and we really needed to provide pastoral care and touch to different groups, we found that allowed us to act. We basically continued our mode. Whereas a lot of our friends, they've got a minister of media arts, a creative arts director, all these things that doesn't quite work except for a very high quality experience or production on a Sunday service. So all of a sudden, I just released our youth guy, our young adult person, our children's person, our adult person, our manor person, just these people, they just went and cared for their flock, their sub flock of about anywhere from 80 to 150 people in our church. And so I think that was a big piece. The reason for that then, the reason why that's critical is when you have a smaller church, it's very hard to kill. I don't know, not that we tried to kill it, but small churches can just seem to go on forever and ever and ever, even without a building, okay, even without money. But a large church vacillates greatly in attendance. And I think our friends in the large church network understand that a lot of times a larger church with significantly more resources than many other churches in the area with a high, I'll call it capacity for excellence in presentation, is a great place to be if you've served for a long time in a medium to small size church and you're kind of tired or discouraged or honestly kind of fed up or frustrated. What that means then is when a pandemic comes or some crisis, their connection to that church is different than someone who is like been serving there in the trenches. Now, in a small church, the pastor can literally talk to everyone and find out what everyone's doing. But in a large church, and I'm talking when the worship services exceed 400 or 500 people in a room, there's no way they know, every minister. There's no way they know all the people. So I found in our church, we have to ask, why do people come to our church? And why do people continue to go to our church? And those are the soul-searching questions. We've been on a call, I think, where someone said, hey, church pastor, church leaders, men and women, if you were this big before the pandemic, and now you're this big at this point in the pandemic, the brother said, that's your new church size. Mm-hmm. That probably varies from situation to situation, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. And that's very sobering. We didn't vacillate as much, but not because, we're better or worse, but just because of the way we've organized. So that's one thought we've had, that the fair resilience of our attendance and our members and our giving. But by that token, I don't have a fancy media team, light wall behind me, like some of these other big churches with their really nice stages and things like that. We're just like a bunch of, honestly, kind of more simpler, humble even appearing smaller congregations. Our largest congregation is like 250, 300 people in one shot. So that's one big difference. So I can find a lot in common with medium to small size churches because I lead maybe a congregation of 300, 400 people. But I also have a lot in common with the larger churches. So it's really interesting how the pandemic has aggravated, accentuated, or exacerbated the dynamics of small churches and large churches. So that's one thing, because our 100-person manor service with a lot of people from mainland China has responded very differently to the pandemic than our 300-person English-speaking, largely, average age 30s to 40s-year-old worship service is very different. So again, I have no idea if that will help any of your listeners, but that's one thing I'm thinking about.
Do me a favor, compare and contrast a little bit about when you say they reacted very different to all of this. What do you mean?
Oh, boy. So in one of our Mandarin services, we have people from Wuhan, China. And I think I've told you the contexts. When I think we were at a retreat together, you and I, when we got the news, wow, the NBA is shutting down a season. People are like, oh, serious. And our church had canceled that Tuesday of. But we know churches that had Saturday evening worship service. And they said, well, we got to call it. So they played their thing. And when we told people that we canceled Tuesday, a lot of people were like, wow, that's so prophetic. No, because we had people that canceled Christmas events that year, the year before, and Lunar or Chinese New Year events. So one of the dynamics is a high sensitivity to the pandemic and to COVID, a great degree of caution. But the other part of that sensitivity is...
And sorry, and that was in your service where there was more Mandarin native?
So it's going to cut both ways, and it's more complex than that. So on the one hand, people that are from East Asia, like born there, raised there, immigrated there more recently, they can have a greater degree of sensitivity because they know people. I mean, the key turning point here in the States was when you heard of COVID, everyone heard of COVID. I mean, I know people who are ICU doctors that heard of COVID, but didn't really sink in until it showed up in their neighborhood or in their
Gotcha.
churches, right? So there's that sense. However, the other funny thing we learned about that was some of these folks have been living with SARS and other things for a long time, and mask wearing is a daily occurrence. So from the same segment, older Chinese-speaking folks, they were very cautious because they're seniors and therefore vulnerable age and very cautious. But they were also people from the same demographic that are like, we live with this. We know how to wear masks. You know, you guys don't wear your masks properly. You youngins or new people are here in the States. You have to cover your. So they're just, it's really strange. But that's a big piece. But they're all older folks, and those folks by and large are still quite cautious across the board, and they haven't returned in as great a numbers. But younger folks, college students look the same. I mean, I'm sure many of them are very careful, but there's a lot of college students walking around and visiting churches in the last couple of weeks in Boston.
And so if you reflect on this time, what have you seen that you've seen God doing or happening that you
Yeah.
say, wow, that's great. Who knew we could do that? Or who knew God could do
Oh.
that through us?
So actually, I was going to go the other way.
Okay. Okay, go ahead.
I thought this in a number of our conversations, but I've never had the wherewithal to say it. I think I think it doesn't matter whether you're a large church or medium or small size church. I think it's taken some wind out of our sails when we were at this number
Mm,
and then the number's less. And I think it makes us ask, why were people coming to our church? And again, that can be very humbling and soul searching. I'll give you the example I've given before of my church, so I can pick on my church first before I extend the attempted analogy to other churches. It was psychologically very challenging, I think, for our leadership to realize that part of the way God grew our church, you asking what God's doing, is we have a Cantonese, Toisanese sort of original congregation. And it grew a lot in the 90s and 2000s. And people probably know, but the big issue was when Hong Kong went back from Britain to China. Massive immigration from there, and Boston, with its great schools and other places, got a ton of them. So we grew a lot as directly from what we would call in local church parlance transfer growth. It's just called immigration in our
yeah,
world.
yeah.
But if you come to Boston, so I think that happens. We all kind of know as church leaders, if you're for the pastors, for the women and men that are pastors and leaders, there's biological growth of church, there's conversion growth, and then there's transfer growth. And most of the growth that we see in the country tends to be transfer growth. And Boston has so many people transient. So I think it's been difficult for churches because they realized we were probably transfer growth and we are a wonderful place for them to grow and serve and learn, but it might not have been as sticky. And in fact, I was on a call this week with some other pastors, and one person shared, I think it was a call that you and I are on different calls, so I can't remember which is straight, but the person said to me, we're getting a lot of people coming visiting our church, and first-time visitors. And people are like, that's great. He's like, it is good. We're grateful. And a lot of them are Christians. And they said, okay, that's wonderful. But he said this, when I asked them where they're coming from other churches in the local area. They're coming from small churches. And he shared, this is the heart of a generous leader. He said, I'm just concerned for those churches that they're coming from. Now, I thought that was a very wonderful kingdom-minded perspective, as opposed to sometimes we get a little narrow and go, that's great. I don't know what God's doing, but he's bringing people. Praise the Lord. Let's go.
Yeah.
But he thought, I'm grateful, but I don't want to have some blessings at the expense of other churches. So I think that is a massive reshuffling of our church populations. And that concerns me. And I don't know enough what's going on. But in Boston, I can definitely see some of the reshuffling happening. But Boston is unlike most of the region. It's very transient. So we're going to get shuffling anyway. But that's a big heart thing. Why do people go to our churches? Why was a church growing? Is it really good preaching? Or was it the vision? Is it great children's ministry? Or was it the vision? I mean, we want to tell ourselves the vision of the church or what God's doing. But the dirty secret in a lot of evangelical subcultures is it's a great music band, or they got free parking. And again, these are tools that we can use to attract people to hear the life-transforming gospel message. But those models those church attractional tools don't really work as well in a pandemic, and you can get someone in really big trouble. And as long as your mom and my mom who are listening to the podcast don't tell other people, I can say this. That's why a lot of pastors, I think, are upset and surprised that someone says, I don't really want to come to church until I can take off my mask. You want to say, come on. But here's, and we've talked about this in the private settings, but if they are there primarily as a receiver, and that's different than consumer, but a receiver, and they don't want to wear a mask, that again, I'm totally speculating here. This is totally dangerous territory. If hopefully we're still friends after all this, but I think a lot of larger churches and medium-sized churches have to ask ourselves, why are people coming? And then the big thing theologically for me is, why do you? Oh man, we're gonna edit this later. Well, probably not. Why do churches who are attracting people from the online audience, what is the mid game or end game, discipleship wise, when someone watches your service from a long way away from you?
Mm-hmm.
How much of that is our strategic discipleship initiative? How much of that is a short term, wow, this is great? To take that brother's perspective, those people that might be going to your church in another state now are not going to their local churches. And again, I'm not questioning the motives of people. I'm just saying there's a whole lot of stuff going on in local church that is probably pretty unique, at least in modern history, at least in my short life. And I think we have to do a lot of thinking and talking about it rather than just only trying out new methods, online campuses and things.
Well, let's probe at this a little bit, coming at it from the layperson who's watching and shopping and moving. And so what does it say about me that I've decided I want to stay home and I'm just going to watch church from now on? And what does it say if I'm not coming back because I have to wear a mask or can't wear a mask, either one?
Right.
We hear every side of it.
Yeah.
And so what is that saying about where I am?
I mean, my honest answer is I don't know.
Okay.
And when I preach, I say that. But I would say, though I don't know which kind of person you are, there are probably several themes that emerge.
Okay.
Let me illustrate by some stories. I know some churches that are going full on maintaining their online ministry platform. Actually, that's their new paradigm. And so they're driving everything there. And if they can, driving it to in-person when they can. So it's all about that. I know some churches, a lot of them are trying to do both, right? Because they want to be in person, but they ask the online. I also know churches that have ended their online presence for several reasons. Usually they're just capacity is so much work. Usually we just didn't like it. Or third bucket was theological and philosophical. And I know churches, multiple churches that, hey, we still have an online version, but it's sort of like the audio recording of the sermon. It's not meant to replace church. It'll be up there. And I know a pastor that even said, okay, if they can't come, we can give them the private link to view it, but they kind of have to go through asking for it so that the pastoral staff have a chance to discipleship. Like, they're not trying to police them. They're just trying to say, hey, we would love you in person. We just love to hear and process this decision for you, with you. Not for you, with you, that kind of thing. And it's funny because people in these churches don't seem to talk to people in these churches because I think they think everyone's like us, and that's what I found. So when I appeal to people online, I say, I'd love for you to be here, but I'd love for you to be here. Secondly, I'd love you to be in person anywhere. But third, you still have to be wise and be willing to accept the limitations of living in a pandemic as the Lord allows. But I think the issue is be honest with yourself. And I can't say this in all in one sermon, but if you slice together all my sermons from the last pandemic, I have returned to that theme. Sometimes you're home for the best of reasons. Sometimes you're home for safety, for convenience, for welfare of others. Sometimes we're staying home because I just don't want to put on pants, or I don't want to even get out of my bed. And sometimes it's the same person going through all those things. And I think the key issue is asking God to show us our heart and why, because like any tool, convenient worship services online is very powerful and effective. I still don't think we know the cost of not meeting in person. So, but again, this is old stuff. Everyone knows about this and talks about this. I don't know any more than anyone else, but that's what I think it might say of you. You should ask yourself why you're at home.
So,
And what do
so
you?
let's say I ask myself, and it's not that I have a physical concern for myself or for others, and it's just I found out I like sleeping a little bit later, drinking a cup of coffee, and watching in my pajamas. And so, what's wrong with that? Why can't I do that?
Mm. I would say I would probably wouldn't say there's nothing wrong with that.
Okay.
I would probably say, but this is how I counsel people,
Yeah.
because I know if I say something's wrong with that, defenses go up. What I would say is,
You're not judgmental enough. I'm much
no,
more
no, no.
judgmental than you are.
Well, because you never know the situation. But here's what I would
I
say.
know. I know.
I would probably probe and ask them, what they like about that. There
Mhm.
is a version where they're just so tired. They
Yeah.
used to go and set up everything. They used to be the people that did all that, and they're just tired, and they just need some appreciation, encouragement, and just like any good vacation or recovery, if that vacation was the rest of your life, this is actually, that might not be super healthy, right? So you
Yeah.
eat a certain way on vacation, and you play a certain way on vacation, and you sleep a certain way on vacation, but you may not want to do that like for the rest of your life. So I would probe into that, kind of ask them. But then we eventually get to certain things. If they have kids, I'd ask them, how do you think this will affect them? I don't even want to tell them my thoughts. I go, have you thought about that? Or I know you and I have been praying for some of your friends that don't believe in Jesus Christ. How are you able to minister to them when one of the most powerful ways is to kind of connect them with other people? So I would just want them thinking about those themes. The way we do church is not the only way to do church, but if we don't do church this way, it's not just watch it online. There's a whole host of dynamics and relationships that we're missing out. And I just would encourage that person to think through, hey, if you want to stay home, that's fine, but how are you going to help the poor? How are you going to share a testimony of your faith? How are you going to invite someone along with you to church? And I would work with them to come up with, hosting an outdoor worship service viewing thing or something. So that's my goal. And the big picture is, if you really feel called to stay home and you want my honest opinion, I'll be happy to share with you if you tell me all your thought processes, and I'll tell you if I think you're, fooling yourself, or things that are good, But you don't. But I'm not the judge.
Yeah. Do
I'm
do
here
most
to help you.
do most of us lay people, though, in your experience, have a good theology of why we gather in person on Sundays and why that's been a historical practice of the church? Or do most of us not have that theology?
You give me a chance to riff on a thing. It is pretty trendy now, as someone who went to seminary, to go, I think we have a weak theology of gathering. We
Hmm.
avoid theology of place because that sounds too Roman Catholic, but basically it's that kind of thing. Um, I would say you could probably say most lay Christians have a weak theology of, you could probably fill in anything.
Mm.
Trinity. I mean, honestly, like, is the Holy Spirit a force? Or I mean, that's one of those things where, if someone says, "Oh, we should probably pray more about X," you could probably put anything in there. So I get it, but I'm not sure how helpful that is. I would
Okay.
think of it more like, as I prepare my preaching calendar over the course of a month and year, these are one of the things I think about. There is a topic right now that's called gathering or engaging. And so this is a chance. Maybe you ask what God's doing. God has given me the perfect opportunity to address it. And again, it is probably deficient because I'm a deficient preacher. I can only do so much. And they don't read the Bible 24/7 and reflect on this, and so I get all that. But rather than I'm like criticizing all our pastors' calls. Rather than bemoan the sorry state of the depraved, sort of the deficient, sub-robust standard of local church theology, I would say this is a chance to lean into it. And honestly, I'll be super honest. We should change the title. Enoch vents his frustrations at all pastors' calls. When we really say a weak gathering of place, we're probably onto something. But I suspect it's, if people were just showing up in person, we wouldn't be talking about that, which tells me that the sum total of a typical leader's theology of place is, do you show up for my service? So it's very like that. If that is the one thing that made you go here, then I'm not sure we have a very robust theology of place, as opposed to what happens there, why they come there, and how they're supposed to go there. So that's what I've been thinking all the times we've been sitting here, and someone goes, "Oh, again, I'm not trying to be critical of anyone. I'm actually trying to be critical of myself." But yeah, I don't. It's our job to bring the Word of God in a timely, humble, winsome, but clear and powerful manner to the moment we live in. And preaching about the local church, ironically, seems antithetical when a lot of these same ministries are also dabbling or heavily going into online ministry. It's, I mean, they're not exclusive. You can bring them together, but you got the same pastor in one call. Man, people need to come out more. Theology Place, and they go, oh, but let's get our internet live stream going. And I think we all need, as a subculture of Christians, to kind of continue to bring these disparate theologies together so we can wrestle with it. So I'm okay with people's theology of place right now, because that's just where they're at, and we'll address it now as a church body.
Yeah, although it sounds like it's something that I don't know before COVID if we would have said we have a weak theology of place or gathering. At least I wouldn't have. So to me, that is one thing I come out and say, hey, I think that is, I think a lot of us went to church because we go to church and there was no other option in a lot of cases. And now I'm not so sure why I should gather with other Christians on a Sunday morning.
Right, right. That, Charles, that to me is the Old Testament. God tells the Hebrew children of Israel to do this, so they do it. And they tell the next generation to do it. And they kind of do it, and they can ask, Mom, Dad, why do we do this? And they, oh, because God did this on the mount or something. The third generation, all they know is to do it. And the second generation doesn't remember how.
Actually, I think more often than not, they've stopped doing it.
Yeah, that's fair. That's legalism, or Pharisaism, is not doing something wrong. It's probably not being clear on why God wants us to do it. And therefore, we don't know how to emphasize or de-emphasize certain priorities. And so when we do it, legalism is you have to do it. And that's sort of the frustrating answer that a new Christian or even a college student asks their Christian parents, why do we do that? Why do we treat that group like that? And I think if none of us knew or talked about a theology of place before the pandemic, that just shows that I have probably a weak theology of place. So we'll go into that another day. But I do think it's, yeah.
In fairness, though, I'm remembering a pastor on one of the calls we were on who was saying, you used to come to church Sunday morning, then you went to Bible study, then you came back Sunday night, then you came back Wednesday night. And now and those were all opportunities where I could help mold you, make you, encourage you into a disciple. And now I get 2 to 3 Sundays a month, maybe for 20 minutes.
Right.
And so that a lot of that discipling infrastructure went away. So it would be logical to conclude, we haven't replaced it with anything. Mm-hmm. And so we've actually lost a lot of the opportunities to be having the conversation about why we gather in person, and other things, right? I've had other pastors say, hey, poor theology of suffering is what I'm seeing in my church, right? Where they think that God mustn't be with us because this is happening. And so I think, so it seems to me that a lot of those conversations would happen if we had more time together. And then somebody else said on top of that, the media actually disciples people in a really strong way every single day, nonstop. And so we've given up what little time we had, and it's been replaced by somebody discipling in a whole different way.
Right. I think that assessment is fair. I just don't think it's new. I think people only noticed it more in the pandemic. I think a small church said that already, except instead of the media, they come to my church and serve on Sunday, and they go to your church Sunday night, your church Wednesday night. And so I think it's just who we're talking to. Parents already know that the amount of influence they're getting from school or media vastly outweighs, those sorts of things at home, if they can even grab a meal around the dinner table together. It's just so, everyone knows that's good, but it's so hard to do, right? So challenging, especially if you're doing the best thing for your kids by getting them into sports and things. So yeah, I think those are fair points, but again, that feels very American model to me, where churches, you go to their building and do it. Whereas in other cultures or settings, churches, everywhere else, churches where God's people are, in terms of the people of God, not the building. Even the phrase "go to church," it's versus I attend that church versus I'm a part of that church, or I belong to that church. Those subtleties, I think, are really different. Some people, that's really what they do. I attend that church. I attend it faithfully. I might even give monetarily to it. But I'm looking for people to one day say, yeah, but do you belong to a church? And do they belong to you? And what is that just semantics, or is that more? And honestly, here's the thing: when you and I, if we're not good preachers, they're not in our church for preaching. They have to find other reasons. That's where you get the theology of place, because it's not good enough to go there for the worship and the preaching. You have to come and get involved with people. If you're primarily there for the preaching, and this is a hard, honest look in the mirror, and this is not, I'm not saying this is true of every church, but if you're primarily there for excellent communication and preaching, then watching it online in a high production level program is very comparable. What a lot of churches are is, I've gone to this church, but I've got to this church after burning out from my church, and boy, I know a lot of people in this church. They all burned out at their churches, and so we're all here. So you can basically, so the Asian version of this, and don't even get me started, but there was this article in the 80s that, it was written by a Korean American. They extended it to all Asians, but it was probably most accurately to Korean Americans, this exodus, and they would go leave the Asian church. Again, I think it's predominantly East Asian, and I would even say more Korean American versus Chinese American or Japanese American. And then they would find out that some anecdotals and some studies would be, in like 20, 30 years they came back, or 10 years they came back. With the leftist teens, they came back. And the arguments or the reasoning was, they realized they're multicultural people. They can code switch and be in a completely majority culture environment or white environment, but they have those values, and they want their kids to grow up Asian and things like that. Okay. Then I came along, my generation came along, and they did that. Here's what they did. They left their parents' churches by and large, and this is not an Asian thing. Like, white kids leave their white parents' churches, right? And then they come back when they have kids and they're married and they want to have their kids, and they come back and they sit down in the service, and I think they go, the preaching's about the same as I remember it. Then they go to a majority culture church, multi-ethnic, but mostly white church, right? And they'll realize, I can get the great white preacher. I'm going to get so much trouble for this podcast. Ray is quite a moderating effect on me. The great white preacher. And I'll speak for Asians. A lot of my Asian friends are here. So I can attend a big church in Manhattan City and get some of the most famous preachers in this generation, and my entire small group is Asian. And so that's a soul-searching thing I think we've had to do in the Chinese Heritage Church, in the Korean Heritage Church, in certain East Asian immigrant churches. And I think there's that kind of soul-searching might benefit the majority culture church. And in New England, that's largely, the white church. And I don't mean white as a, monolithic category, but I mean majority culture. So I think the big reason is this. What is God doing in the health of our individual churches? What do we need to become more aware of? Like you said, we didn't even know we had a category of theology of place, but we need to say something because they're not attending anymore. In fact, they're attending online, which is sort of what we wanted them 8 months ago, but we want them back here. And so I think we're just learning, and I think it's I didn't live through the 1918 pandemic, so I think it's just, there's so many unknowns, and that's what we're thinking about. Just trying to have grace for one another as we navigate, for us, unprecedented times.
But I think you hit on another issue, though, that's worth thinking about too. Is what I heard you saying is that in some parts, some of us, it's more about church is about going to church Sunday morning or Saturday night, and that's an aspect of being part of God's family, but that is not what church is. And so to say more, if you would, about when you're saying, hey, in other cultures, the church is where the believers are. What do you mean by that? What does that look like?
Boy, you need someone smart and godly to answer that question.
That's why you're here.
I guess the best way I would say is, I think most people probably can relate to this concept, though I know, and maybe not everyone has had the chance. When you travel to another neighborhood that's different than yours, or another country or a culture, you go through these phases like, oh, that's really weird. Of course, they look at you as weird, right? And kind of thing. And you do that. And then you come back. And if you live there long enough, you see the reason why they do certain things. And they come back to your home, the culture of your origin. And you can now see how it looks to other people who didn't grow up here. whether that's the same culture but from a different racial perspective, whether it's the same culture but a different economic class, socioeconomic class, if you will, or things like that. So I think when I talk about that, that's what I'm sort of saying. If one were to look at a church and understand how things work, so here's a good example. No one has really made a big stink, to my knowledge, in my church about mask wearing or not mask wearing. They have different opinions. They would disagree. Some would say I'm really wrong, but we'll talk about that. You and I have friends that is like at least the presented top issue.
It split churches.
It splits churches, and and understandably, because it begins to align with more than mask. It's politics, it's it's freedom, it's the political parties, and so it goes really deep. And you have also said this, I think, on this podcast, and when I speak at other churches, like a lot of the friends we have in the Vision New England sort of family of churches, like I've spoken at their multiple service churches, and one thing that blows my mind, which I'm used to it, is I just count how many minutes on a hand or two hands before the parking lot is empty, because everyone goes home and leaves and does stuff. So in my church, they're like, I literally came back from a Vision New England meeting online, and they're saying, hey, worship team, let members, how do you guys feel about wearing masks? What if we came back? They're like, oh, that's fine. No big deal. No big deal. We're just talking about the whole thing. I said, okay, well, just so you know, we probably can't have loitering or fellowship in the building. You can't hang out with people. You have to leave right after. Here's what they said. They said, wait. We can't hang out? What's the point of coming to church? What is the point of even showing up? I could do this at home. The point of coming to church is not just to drop off my kid in a program so I can have time. It's for my kid to, whether it's psychological, social development with other kids in a wonderful God-centered environment, or just playing with other kids, it's afterwards. And that's why immigrant church is like an all-day affair, which is why the weekly small group model breaks when it comes to immigrant cultures, where if church is 90 minutes on a Sunday and then you're gone, then yeah, you can do a couple hours on a Wednesday. But if church is like a 6-hour affair where you cook your ethnic foods in the church kitchen, and then you have your choir, and then your church, and this is the one place, if you're a New England kid, this is where you see other, kids from your sort of ethnic background. If you're a kid, so that's a really interesting thing. When people say we can do online and we can mitigate the certain things, they're starting at a different point. That church means certain things, but in some groups, and it's not just ethnic cultural, it can be any church, but like, what's the point of meeting if we can't fellowship, if we can't socialize? I've rarely heard, here's what I hear I am going to get in so much trouble, Charles. It's like, how do we get these cars out of the parking lot so the next group of cars can get in?
I think in our first church, it was a smaller church, but I would always joke because people would get upset if the pastor went longer than an hour, but then they'd spend 40 minutes in the church talking to each other. I'm like, what are we in such a hurry about?
Well, but that's why they want to get to a vital component of church.
Yeah.
Connecting with people. In fact, sometimes I'm sure people would rather talk to other people than listen to me preach. So I get that.
And so what you've just gotten to, part of the theology of gathering, is church is a relational component between us and other believers, not just an educational thing or a what we would label as the praise part of the service, if you will, right? It's about more than those two things.
Yeah, it is definitely the gathered worship and celebration of Christ's work, the glory of the Father, the goodness of the Spirit. It is also definitely relational, but it's actually missional. Jesus said, I think you say this every time, you will know my disciples if you behave to each other a certain way. One of the most powerful ways that we witness to the world is when a non-Christian comes to church, or an outsider friend comes to church, and they can experience a community that is, by the grace of God, endeavoring to show the love of Christ to one another in spite of political affiliation or background or race or whatever, which is hard, right? Yeah. But I think we're missing out on that. And so how does the watching world see believers love each other online? I have no doubt we can figure out how to do that. I just think it's going to take a while.
Well, it's hard to see, right? John 17, right, 21, I keep going back to, where Jesus prays for unity and says, if the church has that kind of unity, it will be evangelistic. It is hard for me to see that we have unity if we don't know each other, because I just sit in my living room, you sit in your living room. Yeah. I'm struggling with how that's unity. But the other thing I've gone back to a couple of times, I don't know if I've shared this on one of our conversations, is just the idea that Jesus said, when two or more gathered in my name, there I am. And so I don't think any of our theology would say, so if I'm walking down the street one day by myself, God's not there.
Mm-hmm.
But if I happen to bump into you at the corner and we walk down the next block, suddenly God, Jesus is there. And then you turn right and I turn left and he's gone again, right? That's not our theology. So I always take that to mean that he must be present when we're gathered together in a different way.
Yeah. So
and more manifest. And we should want that. And that doesn't, and I struggle with that happens if I'm in my living room, you're in your living room, that we're actually gathered.
Yeah. So that's a great point. But to connect that point to the first point, we talked about it's hard to see, but we've heard amazing testimonies of how if it wasn't for an online format, people wouldn't have joined. And that's absolutely true. So again, that's why I think we just need time as a church to figure out how to do, how to make the virtual interactions more incarnational and things like that. So I do think there's a whole, and again, I'm not down on virtual church or online stuff. I think
people are getting saved, right? Which we never thought was possible. So it's not throw the baby out. Right. But there's something I think that we need to get at, though. At some point, I need to understand I need to be in Christian community.
Right. But going back to Matthew 18, so with respect, I think Matthew 18 is a oft-quoted verse. And I think you're right. You're raising, people often say, where two or three are gathered. I heard it growing up as in like, hey, if our prayer meeting is really small, it's okay. It's like the no one showed up for the meeting, but it's okay thing. But you're right. Wait, so, our prayer meeting has 3 people, and God said if 2 or 3 are gathered, he's here. So then you're like, wait, so if I'm praying by myself, he's not there. So what does that mean? This gets to 2 really profound things that I think we don't do as a church culture in general very well, or not very well, is Matthew 18, in my view, is a context of church discipline. And if you read that, I don't think prayer is mentioned. I don't even think fellowship is mentioned. Is challenging the church. If you as a sister or brother see someone committing a sin, and predominantly it's a Christian person, then church discipline, you can call it an early stage of church discipline, is when one believer says to another believer, hey, I think your joke went too far. Or I think you said that, and I think they didn't expect you to share that piece of information. We call it nudging, but that's basically confrontation. But confrontation isn't about power, or isn't meant to be mean, or doesn't have to be harsh. It's bringing something I just need to investigate this because it doesn't sit well. And I think that person told us in confidence. So that's church discipline. And then my understanding of that passage is, if that person who's a believer you don't win them over, then you bring 1 or 2 witnesses, people who either are a good character or witnessed it, and that goes back, there's an Old Testament tradition to that. And then I don't think it's only 3 steps. I think the principle is increasing level of accountability. So I don't think in a church of 4,000 people, if I tell you don't listen, I tell one guy, oh, we're going to announce it. I think it's my personal theology of that. Mine is an increasing level of church discipline, proportional to the issue. But there is a point at which you have to, put them out, treat them as a tax collector. And in my understanding of treat them as a tax collector, I think people call it excommunicate. And that is probably a possible word. Put them out is that. But if you look at how Jesus treated tax collectors, he loved them and tried to share the gospel. So my understanding, and I'm totally doing this so fast, is Matthew 18 is saying when you make the very, very serious and difficult decision to put this person out of fellowship as a loving last response to church discipline, no, you don't do that on your own. You should never do that on your own. It should always be where 2 or 3 in the name of Christ are gathered under the humble leading of the Spirit. Then know that I am affirming that in heaven. And when you treat them as a tax collector, I interpret that and I preach that as treat them as not a believer, but now you're not trying to confront them and cause them to repent as a believer. You're trying to win them to Christ again. Because maybe their persistent sort of denial or unrepentance means maybe they're not really, maybe Jesus isn't really their Savior and Lord. Maybe he's, maybe they're cultural Christians or something. So that's what I think that is. But to get back to this is church discipline is a probably underrepresented dimension of what it means to witness to the world. I mean, the secular version of it is, hey, we need a public court to catch people that are maybe defrauding churches or abusing people in our churches. And this is Paul saying, to your shame, church. He's saying this to me, to people like me, like, you need the local law enforcement and local justice system to stop people that are abusing children when you guys should be doing that, in conjunction with that local law enforcement. And so that's a woeful, inadequate, weak, robust gathering. Because if my church has never, ever in its entire history enacted church discipline on that scale, either we are amazing or we're missing that.
But I think you're pointing to another thing, and I've been thinking about this. Whether it's exposed in COVID, I don't know, but I've been thinking about it in this whole season, and that is this concept of church discipline. So my experience in church discipline was in one church I was in. It was talked about because it's in the Bible, but I'm not aware that we ever did it. I may just not be privy to it, but I was I was deacon for many years, and I don't remember ever doing it. In our next church, we did it, but it was serious things where we would exercise church discipline. Now I'm wondering, I wonder if church discipline needs to be more active than it is, because when I yell at you on social media, I don't know that anyone in my church says anything. When I'm too materialistic or consumer driven or did not treat my wife well in that interaction, I don't, nobody has ever said to me, Charles, you need to fix this. That did not reflect love when you did that. Now, maybe everything I do reflects love, Enoch, and that would be the only reason nobody's ever said that to me. Maybe there are times where it'd be counterproductive. But I wonder if we don't take that seriously enough, that part of what's being exposed now is a lot of the things that I place politics, right? How you voted over what Jesus told me to love you. And nobody's ever told me, hey, you're doing that.
Right.
And that's wrong.
That's a great insight. Couple strands really quick. One is, if the kid never misbehaves in public, it could be that it could be they're perfect. Or it could be they're really bad and they're really clamping down and they're the pastor's kids. But more likely than not, there is discipline going on at home. And sometimes it spills out in the public scene because, we're limited and fallible people. And I think there's a difference between it spills out versus it's never done or it's always done. So I think that it happens at church. Again, I think church discipline is serious, but it doesn't always mean that it's like a capital offense or something. I think when a teenager says to another teenager, I think you made her cry because I think you went too far with that joking, I think that's church discipline. Like parental discipline is not just when I ground them and take away their internet. It's, hey, please, what do you say? So you say thank you. That's discipline. It's just it's a robust, generous view of discipline. But going back now to the other point you said about politics, you shouldn't put politics. I would distinguish between sort of an error or a growth thing versus willful sin. And this gets really difficult to do in a podcast, but I think if someone needs to be discipled to say, okay, politics is a part of your discipleship and it's not the sum total. That would be one way to do about it. Or, how do you treat people that totally disagree with you differently? Let me explain that. That would be, because sometimes the person's just never been taught that. Doesn't mean it doesn't excuse them, but they've never been discipled in that way. And if someone's never been discipled that way versus they just don't care what you say, I feel like we might handle those situations a little differently. If someone knows this is the right way and they know to treat someone else in their tribe that way, but they treat people in other tribes that way, then you probably need to figure out one-on-one, loving correction. But if someone just, wait, we can be friends with them? I thought they have a different view. I thought we don't like those people. Whoa. No. We're supposed to love everybody.
What I think is going on that I see more of is, it's not that we don't know we're supposed to love people, right? Because we hear that, we affirm that, we agree with that. And yet I react this way to your post on Facebook or this article about the president, whichever president it is or was, or this action. And I start saying things that we're not allowed to say as Christians. Or I respond to them in ways that we're not allowed to respond as Christians. And I'm not saying that in a legalistic sense. I'm saying that Jesus didn't leave us options to be mad at someone about a mask and say it.
So that brings us to public accountability. I think you and I have talked about, well, maybe at least I've said it in some Virgin New England settings. There's a couple high profile, really sad stories of leaders maybe mishandling, and I don't mean that to minimize any wrongdoing. It's just that I'm not there, so I don't know. So I'm trying to be neutral, mismanaging staffing or authority or funds. And then I recently heard in the last year people say, "Hey, why don't you guys deal with that?" And they'll say, "Oh, because there's a famous Christian saying this, and other famous Christians are like not saying anything, but they're on the same board together or something." And I heard someone say this, "Hey, we're not in their denomination. We serve on a board together, but we don't have the authority to come and do that." So it's interesting to hear what high profile people feel. Because I think, honestly, I go, "Man, you're famous. You tell another famous person, like, just like stop it or talk. I hope you guys help each other, right?" But I think I'm discovering what it's like to do that and the challenge to do that. And do they have the people in their life to do that? So I guess I think you're right. The challenge. So if it was in my church and someone was like really doing something that was flagrantly against the clear commands of Jesus online, and it was appropriate, like the easiest would be they're like a leader in our church. So we're already in a relationship where we're equipping them, discipling them. We would say, "Okay, can we bring this up?" And I'm bringing it up to you because I'm on that social media platform too, and I saw this. Like, I'm not catching and policing you, but this just jumped into my feed. So can we talk about this type of thing? And I would go there, and that's probably how it starts. So discipleship is a slow process because you need. People say, "Hey, how do I mentor this younger person, this younger man, younger woman, or something? Is there a great book? Yeah, I can give you a Bible study program, but here's what I would do: take them to Costco with you, and just run errands together. Let them see how you treat everyone in your daily interactions. Take them to a place where they're fixing on your car. Do you pray for them? Are you gracious? Do you tip generously? Things like that." And I think discipleship is in some ways, it's slower than we want. It's not a one focused hour. Parenting, you just saw this. I can't parent you in an hour and then release you. I think it's life on life parenting and discipleship. But at the same time, it's also much faster than we realize, because the things that we think are unremarkable, someone maybe who's watching us catches. And I think it's the blind spots we have. So yeah, we need to. That's the theology of place, where I go eat with these people at church. I noticed something. They tip in restaurants that most people don't tip in. When you're in Chinatown, in a depressed pandemic economic thing where restaurants have been hit, I promise you, you can have so much goodwill by just tipping. Yeah. And we've talked about this, but what a way to love your neighbor. If my son served work food in that restaurant, I would want someone to tip him generously. Yeah. And so that's a very specific to our context.
Yeah, no, I think, but it's important, Enoch, because it gets to, at least for me, there's so many aspects of our life that we need to think about through the lens of what does it mean to love someone, that I think we just culturally accept sometimes that this is what we do. Oh, you tip, it was decent service, tip 15%, 20%, you're done. And if you go to the coffee counter and they just hand it to you, I'm not tipping for that, right? And that's just cultural stuff. But now you're making the point of, so let's step back from that a little bit, because it's possible. Sometimes the culture may not do the most godly thing in the world. It's possible. And I do think we need to think more about some of those things. And the world is teaching us react viscerally without control, and right to everything that's happening. And you're raising the important point of, actually, we're called to be one of the manifestations of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control, and then the ability to think kindness, gentleness, and love. And I think we have a mutual pastor friend I was with last week. He said, "Where are the manifestations of the fruit of the Spirit in the church right now? Where's kindness? Where's love? Where's gentleness?" And it's a good point. That's not to say nobody in the church exhibits any of those things, but it does point to, when you look at the church collectively, it seems like there's a gap in those things for some of us. And so something's broken in that.
Right. Here's one of the things I've also shared when it comes to this online reality. I would find it very, very, I couldn't articulate it yet, but if you said, "I want you to parent your children, Enoch, through Zoom," I haven't figured out the articulation, and I'm sure we can make it work. And God has given humans a great creative capacity, but you make it so that they live, and this happens, right? People have to go to boarding school or different situations or immigrant, refugee situations. I get it. But in general, I can barely influence my kids when they're in my house. Like I have to go on Zoom, and it's so interesting. And I think that's really what we're doing. Would you want to disciple someone online? And again, discipleship, as I think it is, definitely that great book by that Christian woman author or man author or whatever, and those are good. But discipleship is so much more. It's walking and seeing. It's going with my Hebrew professor because he needed someone to drive with him to pick up his car so that we can drive 2 cars back. It's watching the first married couple I've ever seen kiss in front of. He dropped off his wife on the back seat in his bike. He kissed his wife. And what? that's. And then we go to this thing. And again, he might just have been doing it for show because I'm a seminary student. I'm with him. But he just pulls out of this wallet kind of a track and says, "Oh, hey, I want you to have this. Thank you for working on my car," and just walks away. And just simple things like that. And I still remember that because that's just normal life on life discipleship that can be. We can figure out how to do those in an online world, but we just need a lot of time and intentionality to do it.
And so you're raising the point of something needs to be revisited and course corrected on making disciples. But what the result of that is that what we say we believe and how we're acting, sometimes there's a disconnect, which is also a disciple issue, right? It's because I'm a Sunday school teacher, right? So I teach Sunday school, but I'm not discipling you. I'm doing part of what's discipling you, right? Your point is the role models, right? And all of these other things that are gifts of the Spirit are perhaps in some ways, I never want to sacrifice truth, right? But are at least as important as truth, if not more important, because you can have your theology wrong and still be a disciple. It's hard to say I've got my theology right, but I don't love people, but I'm a disciple. Yeah. Is that fair, or have I gotten myself in theological trouble?
I would say, yeah, if you mean in the evangelical subculture of this country, discipler is a specific kind of mentor role. Sometimes my concerns with that is, man, who lives up to that? That's like a Jedi master. So I would probably think that as a Sunday school teacher, you realize the limitations that you cannot be their sole positive Christian discipleship influence. They need more than that. If it was one-on-one, that's where you can share. They can talk more freely and ask you things. Sunday school is a critical part of it. Arguably, Sunday school, which is an institution that was started in this country when I think that Mr. Rakes tried to bring the children in, but if I remember the story correctly. So we're missing that. But as a culture now, because I think we're getting less Christian education. But I think you are part of the discipleship. We just want to make sure that there's more than just that classroom teaching thing. So I would affirm that, because I think everything we do is supposed to be for discipleship. And that's not just a Christian slogan. It really, actually, that's how I encourage people and recruit people. You're discipling them through making it so they can hear the worship team and the sermon. You're discipling them because you're a part of that so they can feel there's a welcoming physical space. But anyway, so.
As you go, make disciples.
Yes, in whatever way God's instructed. And surely we all have to verbalize that, but some of us probably feel more comfortable verbally in leading a Bible study rather than other people are just happy to disciple the invitational, come and be a friend and just be a faithful Christian friend in their ups and downs of life.
I would much rather teach than have somebody watch my life and see how well I observe what I teach.
Well, see, that is interesting, because that's one of the thoughts that we've been chatting about in certain circles I'm a part of. Like, man, it's so easy to have a fully authentic, I won't even say fully. It's so easy to get away with things if you control your tweets, if you're mindful of your Instagramming, because you're framing those things. If our only interaction now with people is not just on stage, but backstage, but not even on stage, it's just online, I think it'll take a while for us to become more real. So real might be you show up and like, oh, you're wearing glasses? Yeah, I didn't have time to wake up and put it on. So there's a difference between being a slob or being lazy or not caring versus, we're here to share about our Christian lives or our seeking. If we're not Christian, we're trying to understand it. It's okay. You're going to see me sometimes without my contacts on, or my glasses on, or not being presentable, or doing my hair, or, hey, nice room. I've never seen this room in your house before. Oh, yeah. The other room's a mess. I can't have time to clean it, so we're here. That kind of stuff. I think that's the stuff that, and actually a lot of people who work in the marketplace, they've learned a lot about their coworkers, right? Oh, I didn't know you had 4 cats, and they'll walk by and flip their tail up on the camera as they walk by. Or I didn't know you had kids, but that cuts both ways because wow, he just yelled at his kids, right? So, that's just life coming in. In some ways, online ministry and meetings have made it much more authentic because you can't hide because it is in your house. On the other hand, it can make it so. Therefore, the medium, though important, I think I invite people to live in the tension. I really want us to want to be in person. It's hard to stay there because if I want that, then I every day have to kind of give that to God and go, okay, God, I really want to be in person, but I can't, but I'm still going to trust in you and be faithful and follow you with your help. It's much easier to go, forget these policies. Let's just go in person. Or it's much easier to go, you know what? Don't worry about it. Just, we'll just be online until whenever. Like, I think it's about saying no. And I think this is biblical to want to be in that tension. I think that's the tension Paul has. Paul said, I really want to see Jesus. Like right now, that would be great. And I want to fan that desire to see Jesus. But while I'm here, there are certain things I need to do. And I would argue that it's Paul's passion to see Jesus that makes him more effective here. Like C.S. Lewis's famous quote, people think that if your head in the clouds, you're useless on earth, but the people that have their minds most in heaven are the most useful on earth because of that eternal perspective. Yeah. So I think that tension, if you really want to be in person and you humbly wait upon God for that, I think those are the kinds of people or mindsets that'll make the most of, okay, we really want to be in person, but we can't. So that means I'm always going to be thinking about how can we encourage each other in ways that will more approximate, get a little bit closer what that looks like. Let's have an outdoor snow fight for family for this fellowship. What a waste of time. Well, yeah, but if we've had a lot of outdoor gatherings September and October or soon planned. What are we going to do in January? So we might just have an outdoor snow fight for a team. I don't know, just sledding, but because people need to interact. I believe most people are scared of dying. I also think most people are scared of being alone. And as a preacher, I think those are often under the surface. I believe I have those fears, though I don't admit it. And I think that will translate to the pandemic and online. I think people want to know that someone cares for them. They want to be missed. And we need to remember that's worth being in person. So anyway, we ranged all over the place. And honestly, I'd be okay if you just played another podcast tomorrow instead of this one. Seriously.
No, those are good words to end on. And I was looking for more condemnation from you because I grew up Catholic, so there's Irish Catholic guilt. I was looking for you to assuage and affirm, and
sorry.
But you were a good pastoral leader on this and shared some great insights. And so thank you. Thanks for all the time you give New England and Boston. Enoch, I appreciate your ministry. I appreciate you, and thanks for being with us again today.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank our audience for being with us and trust that there was something in this God wants to use. So I would pray I think each one of us, we need to be praying about what God wants us to do differently and should he convict us of, not just on this, but in general. I think that's one of my takeaways from COVID is we're too focused on what's wrong with the world and not as much about what's wrong with us. So I'll put that little editorial slice in. I'd like to thank our producer, Ashley Pitkin, and I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Luis Palau Association, who's dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide. If you like this, please share it, like it, follow us, and you can find out more on visionnewengland.org. Our next podcast is going to be Heidi Joy, who's done a couple of podcasts for us. She will be guest hosting with her, I'm calling it her quarterly episode on living with leadership. She talks with pastors' spouses about what are the challenges and blessings and needs of pastors and spouses. And so join us next time for that. Thanks so much for being with us. God bless you.